All is fair in love and war.
Miss Daphne Bridgerton.
This story is interesting because we often see these like Regency period dramas from the women's perspective, and we are in this case, but we're also sort of seeing Anthony's struggle, to like be with the person that he loves and to sort of shepherd his family through this situation. Can you talk about sort of like how that sort of subverts what we've often seen from these Regency period dramas?
Yeah, great question. Super tasty. I think the thing that struck me is that this is a really brilliant way in which we can show how the patriarchy messed it up for women, of course, but also really in a very toxic way, really messes up men. Anthony is a guy who's just not equipped for the responsibility that's bestowed upon him. And I think what's interesting is that I think in period dramas, the sort of romance and the sex appeal is always that the men are emotionally unavailable and stunted, and with Lizzie Bennet having to thaw the icy hearts of Mr. Darcy. This hopefully shows that these men are really complicated, and they don't really necessarily. I think this is true of Anthony. He doesn't have the ability to communicate and to look after people in the way that his role as a Viscount demands of him. I think it's great to be able to explore the sort of toxicity of masculinity, which we're talking about even now in 2020. And by going, through and looking at it from a 19th century gaze, I think it will help us all to identify it, perhaps in an easier and more simple way than if we were looking at our own selves, because sometimes you can't see what's in front of you.
It's interesting because how do I put this? I feel like there's so much of it that sort of like trickles down to even now, to where it's sort of like, in some sense, you can understand that these guys were guarded because it did seem like people were just after what they had. Do you know what I mean? And they couldn't make the choices that they wanted. And so if that sort of remnant is still there, and if you always think people are just trying to get at you for what you have, that's a very awful feeling to sort of
it eats away at your soul,
have hanging around
it?
you. Yeah.
And I think Anthony's soul is being, I think it got shattered the moment that his father passed away. And that's something that I think there's real trauma for him, from being the firstborn and losing the guy that would have been able to presumably help him understand what he needs and how to be that full-bodied man that his father clearly was. I think the idea of privilege has been a massive conversation in 2020. And I think, interestingly, through the Bridgertons, you can see that they're really aware of their privilege, but also really resent it at times. I think every single character feels the pressure to be perceived as one thing, but they don't have the space to make mistakes. And Anthony hasn't had that time, so he's making mistakes. At the live show, he didn't get a dress rehearsal, and that's why it's so costly for him and so painful, I think. And there's nothing worse and more tragic than falling in love with someone and not being able to not being in love with yourself so that you can love them in the way that they need.
Well, speaking of that, I know there was a historian that worked on the show and stuff like that. I'm wondering, there's always a part of you when you're watching these shows that's like, just be with the person you love. You know what I mean? Who cares? Like, he has enough money, he could do it. But like, how ruined, do you have a sense of like how bad it would have been for Anthony and for his family if he had gone off and married this and been with this opera singer full time? Do you know what I mean? If he had just chosen to be with her.
Yeah, well, I mean, I think Lady Whistledown sort of represents Twitter in a way, and the idea of cancel culture. I think if he had gone off and eloped to Gretna Green and come back as the husband of an opera singer, I think the whole of the Bridgertons would have been cancelled, and that's not something that they would have been able to survive, especially him being the Viscount and the pressure. And it's quite hard to understand. But the men, the way they dealt with these things is they duelled, and that's exactly what happens. And it's just an amazing crack in the ability of the people and in like humanity and how they interact. And so the stakes are so high for these characters that's what hopefully makes for a really juicy ride.
And it makes us feel better about how low our stakes can be sometimes.
Yeah, tell me about it. And the stakes just get lower and lower and lower.